So I'm going to give you a relatively basic overview of what battlefield archaeology is and how it's done. I'll go into a number of aspects of this. Initially, I'll explain what it is and how it differs from traditional archaeology, as I'll refer to it. What the evidence of battle is, what it is that we're looking for when we actually carry out battlefield archaeological surveys, and how these surveys are done. That's one of the key issues, and one of the things that makes it more distinct from more traditional forms of archaeology. Interpreting the archaeology, particularly in terms of the material culture that comes out of battlefield sites, and also how we put that into an historical context. And then we'll look at a case study from Edge Hill, which is Robin mentioned earlier, Glenn Ford working at, Jeffrey mentioned Glenn Ford working at Bosworth. Before he did that project, Edge Hill was his PhD thesis, and the archaeology there has helped to reinterpret, or at least provide an alternative interpretation of the battlefield to the historical assessment so far. And then at the end, I'll make some recommendations for survey projects, because I gather that some people here are interested in trying to conduct battlefield archaeology at sites. So I'll make some practical suggestions from my own observations of organising similar surveys at English Civil War siege sites. So what is battlefield archaeology? Well, it's a cross-disciplinary process, essentially, where we bring together the military history, understanding of military history for the period, the tactics and the technology used, archaeological survey, the actual examination of the battlefield topography and the landscape itself, and the artefacts within it, and then put that together with the landscape history. It's all well and good to say this is where the battlefield is and this is where the artefacts are, but unless you know how that landscape has changed since the time of the battle and how it looked at the time of the battle, it's very difficult to understand some of the aspects of the battle itself. There is a process of investigation a standard survey should essentially follow, although a lot of battlefield investigation is far more limited and as I say, doesn't always follow this process specifically. But it needs to start off with a study of the primary accounts. The benefit of studying historic battlefields is that somebody wrote about it. Usually there are first-hand accounts or something relatively contemporary with a first-hand account. The further back you go, obviously, the less reliable those sources become, the fewer they are, and the less contemporary they are to the event. Reconstructing, therefore, an understanding of the event based on the written accounts. You then need to reconstruct historic terrain based on map regression, so taking modern maps and going back through earlier versions to see how the landscape's changed. Understanding from the written accounts as well various aspects. They might talk about enclosures or hedgerows, ploughed fields and such, and it's picking up the information from those that helps to reconstruct the historic terrain as well as documents such as maps. Placing these events, the events described by the written accounts into the topography, you have to understand the actual shape of the ground as well. Understand where the high ground is, where areas of lowland and wet marshland potentially are in the battlefield, to understand how they impact the manoeuvring of armies to the field. Build a set of hypotheses about the way the action was conducted in the landscape, and then go and test them by using targeted survey. You go to an area where you think you should find evidence for something, and then survey and see if it fits the hypothesis. So, what is the evidence of battle for the civil wars? Well, in order to understand that, we have to understand the military technology, and there's a benefit to this period in that there is a great deal more material culture for early modern battlefields than there are for medieval battlefields, and this comes down to the technology itself. The principal finds that we find on the battlefield are projectiles. You don't get a lot of this for the medieval period. It's a lot of hand-to-hand fighting. There are artillery weapons and there are some handguns in the later period. And obviously you get archery, but the majority of these weapons are all ferrous. They're all iron-based, and that does not survive in British soil conditions for the most part. You get some exceptions to that, such as at Taunton, where arrowheads have been recovered, but by and large the iron does not survive in any recognisable format. Projectiles for this period, on the other hand, are lead, and lead is very stable in the natural environment. The principal projectiles you get break down into three categories, essentially. Infantry weapons, so you'll get large caliber musket balls, and quite often slugs as well. The musket balls that have been beaten into a shape that will fit a smaller caliber. Cavalry weapons, you get carbine rounds. It's quite difficult to some extent to distinguish between muskets and carbines, and there's still research going on as to whether or not you can actually make a meaningful assessment of the bore of bullets that are recovered from the field. And artillery shot. Artillery shot is generally very distinct from bullets, and I'm not necessarily talking about iron round shot here. I'm talking about what we call case or hail shot, which are bags or canisters of musket balls in wooden cases or canvas bags that are fired out of cannon. Most people will be familiar with the term grape shot. It's essentially the same thing. It converts an artillery piece into a giant shotgun, and it's used against infantry and a lesser extent cavalry. You get other equipment in the field as well that leaves an archaeological signature. Pieces off of bandoliers, sometimes pieces off of armour, otherwise I'll explain in a minute, those are far less frequent or much harder to identify. And sometimes fragments of weapons, but again, most of the weapon technology, the weapons that they use are steel or iron based, and they decay in the plough soil. And you get a variety of other objects as well that may relate to the battle but cannot be definitely said to be battle related. So you might get contemporary coins, you might get concentrations of buttons and buckles. It's very hard to date the latter two, and coins could just be dropped in the field. There's no definite way of saying this is there from the battle. So interpreting that is somewhat more difficult. So the projectiles, what are the varieties you get? As I say, musket balls generally fall into the range of 10 to 12 bore. That's 10 to 12 bullets from a pound of lead. So the bullets for this period are measured in bore, not in calibre, which is a much later development when you start to get standardised munitions. Majority of musket balls are lead spheres. You do get some variations on that, dumbbell rounds and what look, to all intents and purposes, like a bean bag, essentially. It's been squished in the middle, I suppose. I can't really think of a better way of describing it. So you get some variations, but by and large, the majority that you'll find are round musket balls. And carbine balls and pistol balls as well, obviously of smaller calibers. Each of those has an importance in understanding the development of the battle based on where you find them in the battlefield. Slugs are a slightly different variant. They are musket balls that have usually been hammer struck. Sometimes they are cast as a slug, but by and large they are musket balls that have been beaten into a lozenge or a rectangular prism shape, so that it will fit down the barrel of a smaller gun. The working hypothesis for this is that you get the same mass and same impact damage of a much larger bullet to fit a much smaller gun, possibly a carbine or even a pistol caliber gun. I have actually found pistol slugs at Basing Soap Common. Artillery, as I say, round shot is relatively rare to find. You do get it for medieval period weapons, and sometimes in Civil War, but by and large the majority of the artillery shot that you'll find on Civil War battlefields is case and hail shot, and it looks very similar to a musket ball, I'll grant you, but there's a distinct difference in this, and there's an example on the table at the back of the room. Because these are fired as a bag, as a cluster of balls, as the gun compresses them, they squash together. Lead is quite malleable under heat and pressure. It's not so much when you press it on your fingers, but you'll notice on this that there are several flat facets. This is where the musket ball in the bag is being compressed against others. So you know that this is hail shot and it's being fired compressed against other bullets in the barrel of the gun. So this is how we can distinguish this from a musket ball, and we have evidence that these are definitely formed in this manner, in that quite often you'll find two of them fused together. So we know that that is artillery, and its presence on the battlefield does tell us something quite important about the density of fighting. You get other types of rounds, as I say, usually tend to be quite rare, but by and large, these are the three shapes of bullets, lead projectiles that you'll find in the field. You get other objects as well. As I say, soldiers are carrying a lot of equipment, and in the heat of battle, stuff gets broken, it falls off, it might be dropped running away from an enemy, or the soldier might get killed, and it might end up in the ground for various reasons. One of the issues with battlefield archaeology is that, generally speaking, after a battle, there's a lot of looting, and most of the good, intact equipment will be taken away. Bullets get left behind because it's very hard to find a bullet in the grass. It might also vent it into the soil, going at some speed. But by and large, the stuff that you find on the ground has been left behind because it's not worthwhile or because it's broken. And the stuff that survives generally tends to be lead. These are components of a bandolier. And you can actually see the musketeer soldier here is wearing the bandolier. There's several powder box flasks and a primer flask with In that case, I think it's a wooden nozzle. In this case, these are pewter, so they're lead-based and they survive in the soil. You've got the loops there, the string for the powder box that connects to the bandolier goes through. These objects are really important in interpreting a battlefield because they can only be dropped. They don't get fired, they don't end up several hundred metres from where they came from. They get dropped by soldiers, so when you find these, it's evidence that somebody was stood in the location that you find these. Doesn't mean that you find whole rows of them and you can identify units. That doesn't happen. You might find 5 or 6 across a battlefield, but it helps to build, pull the picture together. Weapon fragments, armour fragments, clothing parts and coins. These are much harder to identify. Most of the iron stuff decays, and what you tend to get left behind are brass fittings, brass buckles, coins, as I say, and brass or lead buttons, things like that. It's very difficult to date them. It's very difficult to say this is part of the battlefield archaeology because they're so generic. It could have fallen off of clothing somebody ploughing the fields, so you don't know, you can't say. But concentrations of them help to build on the interpretation of the spatial evidence. Dr. Glenn Ward on the right there. So what's the principal method of examining battlefields? Is metal detector survey. This is where battlefield archaeology separates from traditional archaeological methods. We're not looking for depth of artifacts because, generally speaking, a battle is a very short affair. They're all going to form a very consistent layer in the ground where they are. What you're actually looking for is the spread over a battlefield, and the principal artifacts are metal, and the best way to find metal artifacts over a wide area is systematic metal detector survey. There's 2 approaches to this that have been employed in battlefields in the UK. Transect method, whereby you set out rows across the field and you detect along strict rows, recovering all the objects along that transect. The second is the grid method. This is slightly less adopted, and I think it's being phased out because it's less scientific in being able to interpret the results, whereby you divide the field into grids, you give a grid to a person and say find all the objects in that grid. There are issues with that approach in that when you have hobby detectorists and archaeologists, what tends to happen is unless you're walking along a strict route, you might get focused in a particular area, and with a grid you don't know whether or not all the finds coming out of the corner of this grid is because that's where all the finds are, or it's because that's where they spent all of their time looking. There might be finds otherwhere they could spend less time. So with transect method, it ensures that you're covering the same amount of the field and you're getting relatively consistent recovery results, so that when you have a gap, you know it's because there's nothing there. How do you set them up? Survey area needs to be marked out. You set out rows of flags at various intervals. The intervals that we tend to use are anywhere between 2.5, 5 metre or 10 metre. We do it in those intervals simply because when you then want to assess the data, so if you do it in 2.5 metres and then you want to assess on a 10 metre scale, you simply remove 3 out of the 4 transects. At the same way, if you do 10 metres and then want to go back to an area because you've got good results, you put the transects in between where you did previously. If you're doing it at varying distances, it becomes much harder then to resurvey. And 2.5 metres is the shortest distance at which you tend not to get an overlap between transects. If you get one person recovering finds from somebody else's transect, it affects the recovery rate of that transect, so it becomes much harder to say how much you're finding. You need to decide on your survey method. For English Civil War, it's pretty much always going to be non-ferrous. You don't have to be picking up every scrap piece of ploughshare, iron nails falling out of a horseshoe, scrap fragments of horseshoes and everything else that you get in the field, all the junk as it were. Although unfortunately you will still recover every piece of aluminium foil, aluminium-backed plastic wrappers that have been thrown out into the fields or whatnot. As you're surveying, for each object they need to be individually bagged, flagged and tagged. So when they're found, they need to be bagged, initialed by the detectorist, they need to be flagged for collection, and then each one needs to be individually numbered and given individual GPS coordinates. As soon as you take an object out of context and you lose the GPS information, you lose spatial context, you cannot assess it for the wider scope of the battlefield. It's an object from the battle, great, where did it come from? We don't know. Well, this was a dropped bullet. It's really important to know whether or not this came from over there or over there, because this was dropped by a soldier. Was there a soldier stood there or there? We don't know because it's been taken without that data. So you have to know the spatial data for each object, and that's really important. This is an example at Morton Corbett where we're setting up for a siege site. You can see the transect flags marked along there and several finds flags dropped where finds are coming out, and we know that there's a good concentration there and none there because each of these transects have been walked individually and individually detected. If this was random wander, somebody might just walked over here, and you'd never know what was there because you don't know where they've been. So, the next stage of that is to put all of the information, the finds, the GPS information into GIS recording software. This is the same site that I showed you a photo of a moment ago where we set up transect flags, which are down here. Each one of those dots is a bullet find. This is actually still data that I'm working on, so I don't have any meaningful interpretation to give you from that at the moment. I apologise. But as you can see, already you're starting to get concentrations of bullets in the field in various locations. All of these areas have no bullets. Not if this was a random wander method, you wouldn't know whether or not that's because they hadn't been detected. We know there's nothing there because they've been systematically detected. And the areas where you get no evidence are as important as the areas where you find artifacts. But as I say, without that spatial context, the objects become meaningless. So interpreting the archaeology relies on understanding the artifacts in their detail, understanding how they got to be where they are, how they relate to each other, and also putting them into the context of the topography and the terrain. Various types of evidence you can see on the different objects. Manufacturing evidence is one category, because I broke it into two, so manufacture and battle related. On the musket balls, in this case, this is the sprue from where it was moulded, where it was put into an individual mould and it's been cut. You can actually see the mould line there, where the mould hasn't quite lined up. You get quite a lot of those on siege sites. It seems to be something that's emerging as a trend there. It doesn't seem to be quite as common on battlefields by comparison. If a bullet still shows things like flash marks, i.e. where the layers are poured through the gaps in the mould, you can almost be certain that it hasn't been fired, because that tends to come off in the firing process, and we know this from experimental activity. What you do know, however, is that a bullet has been fired if it has certain forms of evidence. We can't always say that this hasn't been fired, but we can always say that this has been fired, and there are a number of reasons for that. Banding. As the bullet passes down the barrel of the gun, it rubs against the inner edge of the barrel, and what you get is a flat cylindrical surface with striations. You just can't see, unfortunately, very well on this photo. As it passes down the barrel, it scrapes, and it leaves that mark. That's the only way that evidence can come to be on the bullet. It has to have been fired. Pitting. On the backside of the bullet, you can see it's quite rough, and there are streaks moving away. This is where gunpowder grains have embedded into the back of the bullet, still burning, and pushed past with the gases. And what you get is one side of the bullet will be pitted, and the other side will still look relatively smooth, unless it's impacted something. Impacting damage varies. We can't say a great deal about this yet. One of my colleagues at Huddersfield is actually studying this for his PhD, whether or not we can actually say something specific about the different kinds of impact damage on musket balls, but it is still developing science on that one. And faceting, I've already showed you a picture of the artillery hail shot round, which shows the numerous facets and where it can compress. We need to know how an object came into its position. Was it dropped or was it fired? I've already mentioned, as I say, evidence on the bullets for firing. If you find that in a location, you know that it's not there through having been fired, so it's not in the position that it started during the battle. But if something's been dropped, if you can be almost certain that that object's been dropped, say for a powder box cap, or for a bullet that still has flashing on it, or any other object that has not been fired, it gives you a location as to where troops were actually stood within the battlefield context. There's also a number of reasons why objects move about the field, although it's not quite as disastrous as it might seem from first examination. Earthworm action obviously moves objects down through the plough soil over time. So if you're in an area that's predominantly pastoral or hasn't been cultivated in the last 200 years, it's going to be quite deep. It's going to be much harder to survey because the signals are going to be so much further into the soil. Colluviation is also an issue at some battlefield sites on the slopes where ploughing brings the soil downhill over time, and objects can get moved in that or can get buried deeper, so you might find a concentration of objects at the top of the hill and not at the bottom and conclude that that means there's a lot of fighting at the top of the hill. It's actually just that you couldn't recover the signals because of the depth of the soil further down. And in the plough zone, there's a lot of rotation, obviously. As the plough turns the soil, objects get moved. They tend not to move so much laterally. There are studies actually in place at the moment that Glenn Ford is doing to see whether or not that's a significant movement within the lateral plane. But by and large at the moment it's generally accepted that this is a vertical movement as the plough turns the soil. So a field that's been ploughed since the last time you surveyed it may actually still recover more fines because it's brought objects to the surface. And how do these objects fit in together with other fines? As we'll look at their edge hill maps in a moment, and we'll see the issue of density and how the objects relate. But generally speaking, if you've got a density of bullets and objects, you can generally accept that that's an area of heavier fighting. Where you've got sparsity, or where you have no objects, doesn't necessarily mean there was nothing going on there, but it didn't leave the evidence that you're looking for. And actually in areas where you have lesser concentrations, it might be because of the mobility of cavalry. Cavalry units move quite quickly across the battlefield, so their material culture is spread much more thinly over larger areas than for infantry, which move much more slowly, and the fighting tends to be much heavier. You also get scatters moving away from battlefields that can be detected in areas where their soldiers have been routed. And this is actually one of the principal finds from the Sheriffmuir battlefield in Scotland, is that while the core of the battlefield was destroyed by forestation, the traces of the material going away from it as a result of the rout were what helped to locate the battlefield. So have a look at Edge Hill then. This is the original or the most recent historical interpretation of the battle, with the Royalist army deployed up here on the high ground and the parliamentarian force down here in the valley with a rise there. And the baggage train is actually located over here, but I think it's depicted in these accounts as being behind the left flank of the parliamentarian army. And what happens is the Royalists come down the hill to the parliamentarians that have formed up, and they engage in battle, and it ends up essentially as a score draw. This interpretation has some issues with it, and it's not really understood why it's being portrayed as this. This is the armies have been put out with drill manual spacing, so we know from contemporary drill manuals how armies should fight, and we know the numbers involved. So this is a plot essentially of the soldiers in the battlefield. But the cavalry are deployed in enclosures. This makes no sense. Cavalry cannot manoeuvre through enclosed fields. They are best deployed in open country. Similarly, you've got, I think this is marshy ground over here, and enclosures in between cavalry on the right flank. It doesn't make any sense, or at least it makes less sense until you actually factor in the archaeology. This is a plot of all the finds from the Edge Hill battlefield. All of the red dots are bullets of some form, pistol balls, musket balls, slugs, they're all in there, all as the red dots. The white dots are other finds, some of them battlefield related, some of them not, but I think the majority of these ones are actually battlefield related, so the non-battlefield ones have been filtered out. I might be wrong there, sorry, it's not my map, so I apologise. Concentrations. There's obviously an intensity of infantry fighting in these areas. The areas in yellow were actually surveyed more intensely based on the finds, but when the data is taken out and returned to 10 metre transects on the 2.5 metre that these were detected on, you still get that density within the distribution. This is the principal area of the infantry engagement between the two forces, and this is the location of the parliamentary baggage train, who are armed with firelocks, I think, if I recall correctly. So you get a lot of large caliber musket balls towards the rear of the battlefield. But all out here, you get significant numbers of pistol balls and smaller caliber bullets. These are the pistol balls. Pistols are generally only used at close range, so their location in the battlefield tells us something about the intensity of the fighting and also the engagement distances. You don't generally tend to fire a pistol unless you're quite close to somebody else. A significant portion out here doesn't seem to make any sense if the army's coming down off the ground and then the fighting is taking place here. And then again, all of these out here towards the rear of the parliamentary force. Now, if Rupert's cavalry have broken through and made it to the baggage train, that makes sense. But the core of the fighting is here, and there are enclosures up here. How have they managed to get through? It doesn't quite add up. So Glenn took the finds and plotted them then into the topography of the battlefield. And what you find is actually the high ground extends round in a ridge towards the north, and the density tends to flow through the centre of this area of low ground in the centre of the battlefield. the low ground doesn't really run left to right of the map so much as it runs bottom right to top left. And what starts to happen when you plot these together is you start to build a picture of the fighting. You've got concentrations of case shot down here, so we know this is artillery being fired, but the distribution patterns are in this direction. You've got musket balls coming out here and here. Now what tends to happen with musket balls when you fire them is not that they drop at the feet of the soldiers, they'll either hit them or they'll miss, and they'll pass behind. So what you've probably got there are lines of soldiers fighting in this configuration, and these are the bullets passing by. A lot of the area, I should point out, the greyed out area wasn't surveyed, not because it was, the survey team didn't have time to do it. There's a Ministry of Defence depot across the battlefield that was built in the 1930s, I believe, munitions depot, so unfortunately the archaeology there is lost. So yes, blue diamonds there are the case shot. There are a few slugs as well out here, a few in random locations, but there seems to be a sort of a small concentration there. And again, the pistol balls indicating what would probably be close fighting, and then pistol and carbine shot all out here. I remember what I was saying earlier about sparsity of distribution, about the objects in the context of the battlefield. This is Glenn's reinterpretation based on the archaeology, and it starts to make more sense. The Royalist cavalry following the ridge up to the right, they're not being deployed in enclosures, except for the King's Guard, who on the day of the battle say, we want to take part as well, we should be fighting on the right-hand side of the line, so they end up deploying in enclosures. We've got Rupert's cavalry out there as well. Now what happens as they engage the parliamentarian cavalry is they break through, and this sparsity is the cavalry pursuit going over towards the baggage train. The density of musket balls out here actually relates to units fighting from top right to bottom left, so from the north-east as opposed to the south-east of the Royalist Army. And this also makes sense with the artillery scatters. The cannons that are deployed between the infantry units firing across the battlefield, and you get this distribution of case shot essentially funneling out from the gun. And what experimental work has shown is that once you get down to a much more concentrated survey, you can actually pick out, to some extent, individual clusters of canister and case shot that relate to artillery positions across the battlefield. So I'm just going to finish up by explaining or saying what my recommendations are for anybody planning a survey of a battlefield or a skirmish site based on my experiences of doing the same for Morton Corbett. You need to understand the documentary evidence and the landscape before you go out to survey. The best thing to do with that is try and reconstruct the events before you go out there, because it gives you a better idea of where to go, and if your resources are limited, you need to target your surveying. You also need to understand the historic terrain. If you don't know that this area that looks like it's a pristine field was actually a set of structures that were demolished in the early 19th century, then it won't make any sense when you start pulling out thousands upon thousands of pieces of scrap lead from the demolition. And believe me, for siege sites, that's far more common than I would like. And I say you need to target your survey areas. It's very alluring, I suppose, to go out and say, I want to survey this whole site. It's not always practical, and certainly you don't always have the number of people that you need to go out and do that. So you need to be specific and be prepared to go back over several seasons to go and examine different areas of the battlefield. You also need to understand the limitations of the survey methodology. As I've said, depending on whether it's pasture or cultivated, it will affect how deep the signals are. You might get better recovery in plough fields than you will do for an area that's been grazed for the last 100 years. So you need to understand that when you're actually doing the surveys, and expect that you will find less probably in the pasture fields. There are also equipment limitations. Some detectors are better than others, and most amateur detectorists will have their own preference for a particular detector. So you can't always assume that the whole survey team will be equipped with the same machine, and you'll probably get different recovery results based on that as well. And also the sampling method. If you're going with transects, you'll probably get a more consistent result than with grids, but you might find that you don't have time to walk 200 or 300 metres for every single transect across a field in the space of a couple of days, and you might want to actually focus in on smaller areas. So how you set out the survey is going to be quite important on your time constraints there. Actually doing the survey keeps very tough. It's very easy to get despondent if after 2 days you've been working in the field and you've found 2 musket balls. It's as important to find out where the archaeology is not as it is to find out where it is. This, I suppose, comes, you can point at the Bosworth project for example of that as well, in that spending 2 or 3 years surveying fields and finding nothing is very important, because it means you're probably not in the battlefield. It was only towards the end of the survey when they started to find the lead round shot from the artillery that they said, right, we found the right area now. But without all of that previous work to say there's nothing there, it becomes much harder to pin down where the battlefield actually is. That said, volunteers don't like walking across fields and finding nothing. It gets very depressing. So you need to keep people happy in that regard, and share in the glory when you do actually find something. Share in the misery equally as well. You know, if somebody's having a good day and somebody's having a bad day, don't let them just rumble on, because the chances are that the volunteer will say, I don't want to come back tomorrow, and then your survey team evaporates. And you need to build groundwork for the future when you're on a survey site. You need to keep the landowners happy so they'll let you come back, and you need to keep your volunteer detectorist team or your archaeologists happy so they will want to go back, because you can't do a survey without the goodwill of the landowners and the team. And I say, be prepared to go back. You might find that, certainly if you take the overall Bosworth survey as a short scale, you spend first 3 days or 4 days finding nothing, and then at the end of the last day you find all of it, or all the stuff that you want, but you don't have time to cover all of that aspect of the field. You might find that you have to stop before you've got the data you want. So be prepared to go back either later in the season or on a different season, and make sure that if you're recording your finds properly and your transects properly, that you keep that data safe, because that will help you then plot out where you go and survey in the future. So make sure that you're prepared for going back. It's a battle, not a fight. You've got to play out the whole thing over a period of time. I suppose it's more of a campaign than a battle, really, but it depends on how you survey the site. Thank you.
Right, okay. Has anybody any questions for Richard?
Richard, one of the questions which we are asked on battlefield walks with the greatest regularity is, where are all the bodies? Is there something you could...
Right.
I knew you'd like this one.
Yes, I actually have a colleague starting later this year who will be looking at mass graves.
Yeah,
for
something you could say
battlefield.
about the problems of finding
Yeah,
the like.
it's pretty much impossible for a number of reasons. They are very small features. I mean, even a grave that contains several hundred people is actually a very small hole in the ground. It need only be 10 metres by 10 metres to fit in several hundred bodies, and finding that in the scope of a couple of hundred acres is much harder. They tend only to be found by accident. Trying to actually go and find a mass grave is very difficult, because you don't know where they're going to be positioned. We expect they would be nearest to the greatest concentration of bodies, because you don't want to carry decaying corpses very far before you throw them in a hole in the ground. So they should, in theory, be close to the greatest concentrations of killing. That said, when people have gone out to look for them in the past, it hasn't always worked. There is an exception to that. Andre Schergar at Lutzen battlefield in Saxony, this is the battle which Gustavus Adolphus has killed, was challenged to go out and find a mass grave, and he's, to my mind, the only person who's ever gone out to find one and found one. He's a genius for a whole number of reasons, but he is forever in my accolades for that. He's a brilliant archaeologist. Most mass graves are incidentally found. Some of them are known about and are scheduled, and I think at East Stoke, for instance, there's a couple of scheduled monuments there. But by and large, they are very hard to find. In terms of the metal detecting, you might find evidence for them in terms of artifacts at the top of graves. You might find concentrations of buttons and buckles, bits of clothing where, as they drag the bodies together, stuff has fallen off. But by and large, they are not easy to find. Bones are not metallic. If bones were metallic, well, calcium obviously, they're not metal in terms of being able to find them with a detector, and if they were, it'd be a heck of a lot easier to find these concentrations of signals. You could go and use a resistivity survey or magnetometry or whatnot to find areas of ground disturbance. But again, it's a needle in a haystack. You're probably going to cover several hundred hectares of ground before you even find a signal that's remotely like it, and to my knowledge that has not yet been accomplished for a battlefield.
How helpful are landowners in terms of getting access?
It depends entirely on the landowners. Some are very happy. Most landowners, generally speaking, don't mind. It's the farmers that you need to be on side with, because if it's agricultural land, as it generally is, the landowners are okay with you going on and surveying by and large. But you need to make sure you fit in with the farmer's survey. So you might have the whole of 2016 to do a survey, but that field is only going to come available for 2 weeks because the farmer's harvesting the wheat and then he's going to plant maize. And there are various issues with different crops as well. You can't detect in maize stubble. Wheat stubble is very hard to detect in, but it can be done. Your best bet is to do it after the field's been ploughed, before the seed has been sown, or immediately after the seed's been sown, so that you're not disturbing the crop. And individual crops have different windows of accessibility. So you can walk over wheat when it's very young, but once it gets to some degree of height, it's going to be damaged a lot more easily. So best thing to do with that is speak to the farmers. Quite often they are willing to talk to you if the landowner's happy. Some are less happy if they've had to deal with amateur detectors going on the land without permission, and you might find the number of hostile landowners in that regard as well. But if you build good relations with them, explain to them what you're doing in this archaeological survey, and you're not, for want of a better word, looting the site for whatever you can find for your own pocket, they're much happier to speak to you. And finding out what the crop rotation is going to be very important in planning any kind of survey.
How did it show us the battlefields to fight in the first place? And what were the defenders look at in the middle of nowhere? And how do you find if there's going to be a battlefield?
It varies from period to period. I think for the most part, battlefields tend to be incidental in that armies are on the march through the terrain. They encounter each other within relatively short distance. Scouts report, we found the enemy armies is over there, and you pick your terrain to fight. Generally speaking, the army that gets there first gets the best terrain. But it's not as if they go out and say, right, these are the designated battlefields, we'll meet you here. It's wherever they can get, and this is why they have to contend with issues like enclosures on the edges of the battlefield that are going to prevent manoeuvrability. In fact, in the case of the Parliamentarian Army, they anchor their flanks between the enclosures, so it's much harder for the enemy cavalry to move through. It doesn't work out for them in this case. Similar instance at Culloden battlefield, Jacobite army anchors itself between the enclosures, but what happens is the government army comes along, sets up out of distance, and then starts pounding them with artillery. So the Jacobites have no option but to engage on the offensive, and it puts them at a disadvantage because they picked the best ground to defend. At least they thought so. So it really depends on the circumstances for each battle as to where they fight. But generally speaking, open ground is what they're looking for because they want their armies to be able to manoeuvre and actually engage.
How do you know when it's been a battle? How do you want to go for it?
Generally speaking, we have to rely on the historical accounts for a lot of battlefields, and obviously that has issues because the primary accounts then get reinterpreted by historians who say, oh well, it's clearly here based on this evidence, and it's not. Bosworth is a beautiful example of that. I think there were 3 proposed battlefield sites, and it was none of those in which the archaeology ended up being found. And this is one of the benefits of archaeology, is that the material remains. It's like the forensic evidence for a crime scene. You've got the witness testimony, which is the historical accounts, but you want the forensic physical evidence on the ground to say this is what happened. And archaeology provides that aspect for battlefields.
I would say that there are very few battlefields where you could say there was 100% secure location exactly where things were. I mean, major battlefields, but where we don't really know. Take Bannockburn, for example.
Yeah.
Major battle, but still not even if Tony Pollard thinks he's found it.
Well, even I mean, Bannockburn has a number of distinct problems in that the soil is very boggy, and the peat around the river becomes moisture-logged and then dries out, and moisture-logged and dries out. For survival of any artefacts, that is probably the worst case scenario because they're going to decay in a short space of time. The fact that they found anything from that battlefield, I think, is remarkable. I was going to draw on another example there, sorry, and it's completely escaped me. for a number of battlefields, we're not entirely certain. Hastings is the one I was going to pick up, sorry. The Abbey is built on the site based on the fact that William said this is where the battlefield is. But we don't have any evidence yet to come out of the site to pin it down. There are a couple of suggestions for that, and Glenn is actually busy surveying Hastings, has been over the last couple of years, to try and find the site. One of the added problems to that is because it's publicly accessible and there have been fairs and reenactments and such over the area that we think the battlefield is in, it's full of modern rubbish in the topsoil, and that's where the artefacts are that we're looking for. So the surveying method becomes much harder, and various mitigation methods have to be put into place to try and get rid of that and the rubbish in order to be able to find the archaeology we need.
Have you been able to hypothesise in the incidence of the use of case shot as against round shot, and which circumstances was one preferred over the other?
Round shot tends to be a distance weapon. What happens with artillery cruisers is that they like to bounce the shot off the ground, so they will fire short and let the cannonballs bounce and roll, so that they're actually, rather than flying over the heads of soldiers, they're actually impacting at body height as they skim along the ground. One of the issues at Edge Hill for the Royalist artillery doing that is that the area is cultivated in ridge and furrow, and what it's described in the accounts is that they're firing across the lands, and what has been interpreted from that is that actually they're firing across the direction of the ridge and furrow, so instead of bouncing, it's getting lodged in or getting caught in the gullies, in the furrows in the field. Case shot tends to be a much closer range weapon. If you fire at too far greater distance, it doesn't carry enough momentum by the time it actually reaches the soldiers. But also, it's a weapon, ammunition that's used to break enemy formations. It's designed to make soldiers say, "Stop this! We're going. We're running. We're not going to face this. We don't like getting killed. Thank you." So it's very much an intimidation weapon as well. But it's generally fired when armies get close to engage. The problem with trying to use round shot at that distance in any kind of direct way is that once the infantry engage and you get all the smoke from the black powder, you can't see what's going on. So the best way, rather than targeted artillery, is to just spray bullets into it.
So it's frequently used with case shot. I knew case shot was used, but I didn't know how frequently.
It's been found on every battlefield that's been surveyed, and it's also been found at Basingstoke Common from the sieges there. Nothing from Morton Corbett, but the historical accounts from Morton Corbett don't say that there's any artillery at the site at all. This is the site I'm working on. But it seems to be very frequent.
Thank you very much.
All sergeants in the same equipment and shotgun area?
Yes. Yeah, there's no one technology that's for the parliamentarians of the Royalists. Because it's a civil war, they've got access essentially to the same armours, the same arsenals.
And did you find any evidence of the campsites for these battles? Are they close, or do the battles take quite a distance away?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that one. I'm afraid obviously Glenn might have more information about Edge Hill that doesn't relate specifically to the battle, but to the campsites. It might be easy to find them for siege sites because the benefit of the siege is it's usually there for several weeks or months. So the density of material is going to be much greater from habitation for a small area as opposed to maybe an overnight stay. But to my knowledge, nothing like that has yet been found for a battlefield. But I'm not sure if that's something that actually they've set out to find. And quite often, at the early stages of the day of a battle, the army will march a couple of miles to the site that they end up fighting at, so they don't tend to camp on the battlefield per se.
Yeah, the armour that you see, I think, at the back of wherever you go museums, it almost looks as though it wouldn't fit a child on today. I'm just wondering if there's been any research to say what the average
I think for the English Civil War period, I'm average height, so that I'm just over 5'6". I think that's about average.
I'm just standing next to you to show you what real height is about.
I like to refer to myself as a proper height and everybody else being obscenely tall. So yeah, generally speaking, people are shorter. I think that's to do with various reasons for nutrition as well as people getting taller generally all the time. One thing I don't think I really touched on in any great deal, but the types of troop that you find in the battlefield, as I said, the majority of the evidence is musket balls. The kind of armour that we have back there is the sort of stuff that's either worn by pikemen or by cavalry, but it doesn't survive. So the evidence that we have in the battlefield for the location of soldiers generally tends to be for the projectile-based infantry or cavalry. so you don't see pike formations in the field. The evidence for their existence generally is not there because the armour decays or gets recovered after the battle because it can be repaired. The wood from the pikes doesn't survive, obviously it will rot and decay, as does the iron or steel tips. Pretty much nothing from their kit survives. And the only examples where we do get stuff like that either comes out of stratified contexts at siege sites or from survival of equipment from the period.
Can I just add in, one of the things you need to keep in mind is that is really base munition armour. It's churned out in vast numbers, it's not fitted, it's not made for a particular person, so they probably do, I don't know, small, medium or large. And if you turned up at the end of the queue when they're dishing it out, you take what you're given. The other thing is, it doesn't fully close together. Right. There will be gaps. It's worn over other protective wear as well a lot of the time. And it's only there to defend the vital middle bit of you.
Yeah.
It isn't meant as an all-round protection.
Sometimes you see the shoes of the kings or something.
Ironically, it's the gaps that probably are the most important part in terms of survival of archaeology, because that's where you get the brass buckles and fittings that will survive in the sort of the copper-based alloys that survive, other metals. But the iron tends not to. It tends to decay very quickly in British weather conditions.
We're having a talk. Jeff is talking after lunch about costume equipment. So if you have questions going down that line, then perhaps you can go after lunch.
We all know, I think, the two major battles of the Civil War were Marston Moor and Naseby. I know Naseby in recent years seems to have developed a lot. There's a big visitor centre now, battlefield centre, but there's nothing that seems to be happening at Marston Moor. Why is that?
Quite honestly, I don't know. I suspect Jeffrey will have more idea of what's actually going on at Marston Moor through contacts with the Battlefields Trust. In terms of the archaeology, Marston Moor is a site that's been troubling over recent years, particularly because there have been metal detector rallies there. People going in mass groups to metal detect across the site and taking back musket balls and stuff, unrecorded spatially. So a lot of the archaeology has been lost through this hobby activity. While some metal detectors have a very good relationship with archaeologists, and some actually are exemplary in that they spatially record every single find and individually bag and number stuff, they are very few and far between. And unfortunately, a lot of the damage that happens to the archaeological evidence sites is not only from development, but it's from unrecorded metal detectors.
So I would say, Marston Moor, I can't give you the up-to-date thing. I'm slightly outside of my area. Louise, the chairman of our Yorkshire region, was here, she might be able to tell us a little bit more. Part of the problem is that it's always down to resources. It's down to find people, volunteers, and money. Unlike, say, in America, with American Civil War sites, there is no national funding to do anything anywhere on any battlefield sites in the UK. So money has to be raised, often from the lottery fund for a project or whatever, or we raise money from various sources. So if you can find the people, the money, then you can do something. And certainly I think there have been various plans to do this at Marston Moor. Plus then you have to take account of the point that was made earlier, which is what the landowners and the farmers want. None of this land is in national ownership. Again, if you go over to America, our equivalent organisation, which is called the Civil War Trust in America, America's a different place. The Civil War Trust has an annual income of $14 million a year, and that's pretty much charitable income. And it buys big chunks of battlefields at Gettysburg or Antietam or Shiloh or whatever, and preserves them. We don't have the resources in this country to go and buy Marston Moor. So that's really the answer. It's down to local people and local resources and what money is available.
And in addition to that, in America, they also have the Forestry Commission, which own a lot of the land that the battlefields fall into as national parks, essentially. There's a slightly different pressure there. The Forestry Commission also has to make this space something of worth to the public. And sometimes battlefields aren't necessarily considered to be the most important thing as, say, a nice area of parkland. And depending on the historical interpretations of the battle, it can actually lead to destruction of the archaeology. chopping down of orchards, for instance, at sorry, the name escapes me. It's a battlefield my colleague knows very well. American Revolutionary War battlefield. They chopped down the orchards to give a better view of the battlefield, despite the fact it was one of the terrain obstacles accounted for in the battle. So again, state ownership and state involvement is not always necessarily the answer to it. But people with an interest and care for the battlefield actually being involved in its management, I think, is probably the way to go.
Local activists, local enthusiasts,
Yes,
is
exactly,
what really
yeah.
makes things happen.
Yeah.
Take the last question over here.
Thank you very much. Could you just expand a little bit on landscape history? How do you go about trying to reconstruct what the landscape was like?
I'm afraid that one's really not my field. It's largely to do with taking documentary accounts and historic maps and bringing those together. You might get shreds of information from the description of, say, parish holdings, for instance, that describe the land use around the parish. And you might be able to use that to say, well, actually, this area of land, although it's now developed, was originally pasture farmland, for instance, and it might help you build a picture of the landscape the battle was fought in. As I say, I'm afraid it's really not my area of expertise.
If you can have in mind for my
yeah.
talk at the end, I'll be able to give you more of an answer to that one.
We've done a little bit, had a little bit of work. We find geographers are really handy. Geographers are great people. In Northumberland, in the Till Valley, we've had geographers who have done corings all the way up the valley. And they can tell us how the landscape's changed over the last 400 or 500 years. From deep coring, they can say where the land was marshy is now, or has now been drained, it was marshy then. So that's really geographers which have things like that in my experience.
And as I said at the very beginning, battlefield archaeology is very cross-disciplinary, and we pull on people from, and certainly with the experimental firing, we pull on people from ballistics and sciences, in terms of the analysing the lead shot from the Mary Rose, for instance. Physicists were brought in so we could do neutron tomography so we could see what was inside the lead. Geographers, as you say, and historians, clearly. There's a real importance for a whole sort of wealth of skills coming together to assess a battlefield. And generally speaking, one person can't have all of those skills, so building a core team of people is very important for any kind of survey.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Richard. It's very enlightening question and answer session as well.